Captain Harold Mitchell saw the parachute before he saw what hung beneath it. His crew called the run a catch. His orders called it recovery. In plain language, it meant this: fly out over open ocean, find a small metal bucket falling from space, and hook it out of the air before it touched the water. If he missed, the bucket would float for a short while, then salt plugs in its base would dissolve, and it would sink to the floor of the Pacific and carry its secret down with it. The bucket was dropping toward him right now. It held the first roll of film ever returned from orbit. The morning air over the ocean was bright and almost empty. His aircraft, a fat twin-boom cargo plane the crews called the Flying Boxcar, trailed a long loop of nylon line and steel hooks behind its open tail like a net dragged through the sky. It was August 1960. He was flying roughly 360 miles southwest of Honolulu. He had already made 2 passes at the falling capsule. Both had come up empty. He had fuel and daylight for only a few more. Before we go on, I want to ask you something small. Cold War Impact is a small history channel, and lately our views and our reach have dropped off sharply. If you find these deep dives worth your time, please subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with someone who loves this era. Every one of those small actions tells the platform to show this work to new people, and it is honestly the only thing that lets me keep making documentaries like this one. Thank you. Now, back to the Pacific. For almost 3 years, the most powerful country on Earth had been terrified of a weapon it could not count. The fear had a name. People called it the missile gap. The idea behind it was simple, and it was frightening precisely because it was simple. The Soviet Union, having shocked the world by putting the first satellite into orbit, was now supposedly building intercontinental missiles in huge numbers, and the United States was falling hopelessly behind. Air Force intelligence carried an estimate that the Soviets would have 500 of these missiles ready to fire at American cities by the year 1960. Some public voices went much further and spoke of 1,000 or more within a few years after that. The nightmare that followed from those numbers was specific and total. A single Soviet strike, launched without warning, could catch the American bomber force on the ground, destroy it before it could take off, and leave the country open and defenseless. Here is the strange part, the part that makes this one of the most remarkable stories of the entire Cold War. The terror was real. The army was not. When the truth finally came out, the Soviet Union did not have 500 missiles able to reach the United States. It did not have 100. It did not have 50. At the very moment America was most afraid, the Soviets had a tiny handful of these enormous rockets, so few in number and so clumsy to operate that they could barely be called a fighting force at all. The most dangerous weapon of this entire crisis turned out not to be a missile standing in a Soviet field. It was a camera riding inside an American satellite. And to understand how a bucket of film falling over Hawaii could end a panic that had gripped a whole nation, we have to go back to the autumn of 1957, when the United States first discovered, in the worst possible way, that it had gone completely blind. What almost nobody outside a small circle understood at the time was this: the weapon that would eventually close the missile gap was not a weapon at all. It was 3,000 feet of photographic film wound inside a metal capsule. And before it ever worked, it failed and failed and failed again. The panic began with a sound. On the night of October 4, 1957, a small, polished metal sphere passed overhead in the darkness, and Americans went out into their yards to listen to it beeping on shortwave radios. It was Sputnik, the first artificial satellite in history, and it was Soviet. To the public, it was a wonder and an insult at the same time. To the handful of people who truly understood the technology, the sphere itself was almost beside the point. What frightened them was the rocket underneath it. The Soviets had lifted Sputnik using the very same booster they had first tested as an intercontinental missile only weeks before. On August 21, 1957, the logic was cold and impossible to argue with. A rocket that could push a satellite into orbit could push a nuclear warhead across the world to an American city. Then, on November 3, they did it again, launching a second satellite that was far heavier than the first and carried a living dog into space. The lesson seemed clear and grim. Moscow could throw heavy loads into orbit seemingly whenever it chose, and Washington so far could not. 4 days after that second launch, on November 7, 1957, a secret committee delivered a report to the National Security Council that would shape American fear for years. It had been assembled under a foundation chairman named Rowan Gaither, and it drew on the labor of dozens of scientists, engineers, and strategists. Its message was alarming. It warned that within a few years the Soviet Union might be able to launch a surprise missile attack heavy enough to knock out the American bomber force on the ground, and it called for a large and urgent expansion of American strength to prevent it. The report was classified at the highest level. It leaked to the press anyway, as such things do. Newspapers described a nation drifting towards second-class status, exposed to the immediate threat of a missile, armed and rising enemy. Once fear, like that, is loose in a democracy, it does not quietly go back where it came from. It becomes an argument, and then it becomes a campaign issue, and then it takes on a life of its own. The country responded to the shock with an energy that today can be hard to picture. Schools rushed to overhaul the way they taught science and mathematics, convinced that Soviet classrooms were somehow producing better engineers. Within a year of Sputnik, Congress passed a sweeping national education law to pour money into training scientists and linguists. The government created an entirely new civilian space agency, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, and it stood up a new military research organization charged with making sure the United States was never again surprised by an enemy's technology. Underneath all of this frantic activity ran a single anxious question that no amount of new spending could immediately answer. If the Soviets were this far ahead in rockets that could reach space, how far ahead were they in the rockets that could reach American cities? And here is the detail that should have made everyone more cautious, and did not. This was not the first time the United States had frightened itself over a Soviet weapon that turned out to be far smaller than feared. Only a few years earlier, in the middle of the 1950s, the country had worked itself into a similar panic over Soviet bombers. At a Soviet aviation display near Moscow in the summer of 1955, Western observers watched formations of new heavy jet bombers pass overhead and came away convinced that the Soviets were building long-range aircraft at a frightening rate. The popular story that grew up afterward held that the same handful of bombers had circled back out of sight and flown past again and again to fake the size of the fleet. Historians still argue about exactly what happened that day, whether it was a deliberate deception or simply Western analysts overcounting what they saw, and even the numbers that observers reported do not agree. But the essential outcome is not in dispute. The scare had a name. People called it the Bomber Gap, and it drove real decisions and real spending before better intelligence, including the first American spy flights, quietly revealed that the great Soviet bomber fleet was far smaller than the alarm had claimed. The bomber gap should have been a warning. Instead, when the missile gap arrived a few years later, wearing almost the same shape, the country believed it just as readily as it had believed the first one. And underneath the fear lay a humiliation that the public never fully grasped. The United States could not see. It could not answer the one question on which everything else depended. How many of these missiles did the Soviet Union actually have? The Soviet Union was the most tightly closed society on Earth, a single landmass stretching across 11 time zones, sealed shut against foreign eyes. American intelligence had exactly one narrow window into it, and that window was a spy plane called the U-2. It flew so high that Soviet fighters could not climb to reach it, and it carried cameras that could photograph the ground in astonishing detail. But it had two crippling limits. Each flight crossed only a thin ribbon of that gigantic country, a single track through an ocean of unseen land. And each flight was a diplomatic bomb waiting to go off, because it was, in the plainest terms, a violation of Soviet airspace that could explode into an international crisis the moment one was ever brought down. The planes photographed a handful of test ranges and a few suspected sites. Between those thin ribbons of coverage lay millions of square miles that no American had ever laid eyes on. Somewhere out in that darkness, the missiles might be gathering by the hundreds, or there might be almost nothing there at all. No one in Washington could say for certain which it was, and that inability to know was itself a kind of defeat, a blindness at the center of national security. The cruelest detail was this. A plan already existed to flood that darkness with light. It was a camera that would fly through space and photograph the entire country from above, beyond the reach of any fighter or any missile. The plan had presidential approval. It was already being built, and month after month it kept tearing itself apart on the launch pad. The man who ruled the Soviet side of this fear understood the game he was playing better than anyone. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet leader, had built his whole strategy on a bluff, and he played it with a gambler's nerve. He was loud, shrewd, earthy, and entirely willing to stake everything on a card he knew was weak. He had grasped one essential truth. If the Americans could not count his missiles, then the true number he possessed mattered far less than the number they imagined he possessed. So he told the world he had them in abundance. In the years after Sputnik, he boasted that Soviet factories were turning out rockets like sausages, one after another rolling off the line. That vivid phrase is usually quoted in exactly that crisp form, and the precise wording shifted from one speech to the next. But the boast itself was real, deliberate, and repeated for years across public platforms, including from the podium of the United Nations. His own son later described the strategy without flinching. What actually mattered, he explained, was not the real size of the arsenal at all. What mattered was that Americans believed in Soviet power. The bluff worked for one reason above all others. It could not be checked. Khrushchev pressed the performance everywhere he went, including onto American soil. In the autumn of 1959, he toured the United States for nearly 2 weeks, a peasant son turned master of a rival superpower, by turns charming, boastful, and combative before crowds and cameras. He needled his hosts about Soviet rockets and Soviet progress, and he let the implication hang in the air that the machines behind his boasts existed in numbers to match his confidence. It was theater, and he was very good at it. Every appearance, every claim, every knowing smile added another layer to the impression he wanted the Americans to carry home in their minds, that Soviet power was vast, growing, and not to be tested. He was selling a picture, and a frightened audience was buying it, because the one thing that might have proven the picture false was still sitting on a launch pad in the American desert, refusing to fly. Behind the boasting stood a genuine rocket, and it deserves real respect, because as a machine it was a triumph of engineering. It was called the R-7, and it was designed under a man the Soviet state would allow the world to know only as the chief designer. His true name, Sergei Korolev, was itself a state secret, guarded as closely as any weapon. The R-7 was the first true intercontinental ballistic missile ever built by anyone. It was the very rocket that had launched Sputnik. It stood about 34 meters tall, a central core surrounded by 4 strap-on boosters that all ignited together at liftoff in one enormous blossom of fire and thrust. As a way of reaching space, it was magnificent, and, in modified forms, its descendants would carry human beings into orbit for decades to come. Even that first success had been hard-won. The rocket's earliest test flights in the spring and summer of 1957 had failed, one destroyed by a fire in a booster shortly into flight before the design finally flew its full distance that August. Its dummy warhead broke apart on the way back down through the atmosphere, but the flight still announced to the world that an intercontinental rocket was real. It was a machine wrestled into existence at the very frontier of what was possible, and everyone that stood ready represented an enormous investment of money, engineering, and scarce industrial effort. That too is part of why there were so few of them. As a weapon of war, it was close to useless, and this single contradiction is the fact on which the entire story turns. The R-7 ran on liquid oxygen, a propellant so extremely cold that it cannot be kept sitting inside a fueled missile for any length of time. That one property crippled it as a weapon. A crew simply could not keep the rocket standing on alert, fueled and ready to fire at a moment's notice, the way a real deterrent must be. Fueling it demanded a small army of technicians and many hours of work, on the order of 20 hours of preparation before it could fly. And once it was fueled, it could stand ready only briefly before the freezing propellant had to be drained away again. Its launch complexes were gigantic, sprawling, exposed structures, soft targets that a single well-aimed bomb could destroy, and there were almost none of them to begin with. The Soviet planners had at first imagined building dozens of launch pads, then quietly abandoned that dream as hopelessly impractical and expensive. So the true Soviet intercontinental force, the thing that American imaginations had inflated into a wall of 500 missiles, was in reality a mere few colossal rockets standing on a mere few enormous pads, most of which were far more useful for launching spacecraft than for waging war. The numbers, once they were finally known, were almost impossible to reconcile with the years of terror. The first Soviet intercontinental missile did not even go on combat duty until January of 1960. By the end of that year, only about 2 launchers had been deployed. At the very peak of this particular rocket's career as a weapon, around 1962, the Soviet Union fielded roughly 4 operational launches of it. 4? That was the terrifying army that had frightened a superpower. Khrushchev knew exactly how thin his hand was. His entire performance rested on a single assumption, and only one. He assumed the Americans would never be able to see his missile fields, and therefore would never be able to count what was actually standing in them. As long as the darkness held, the bluff held with it. That assumption was about to collapse. And the tool that would shatter it had already been approved by the President of the United States and set in motion inside a program hidden behind a deliberate lie. The idea took shape in the anxious year that followed Sputnik. The reasoning ran like this. If a spy plane could be shot down and a satellite in orbit could not be reached by any weapon then in existence, then the obvious answer was to put the camera into orbit. A satellite flying a couple of 100 kilometers above the Earth could pass over any point on the planet, again and again, entirely beyond the reach of any fighter or any surface-to-air missile, and photograph everything spread out below it. In February of 1958, President Dwight Eisenhower gave his personal approval to a secret program to build exactly that machine. To conceal what it truly was, the government wrapped the whole effort inside a bland civilian cover story about a research and engineering satellite program called Discoverer. The cover story was maintained with real care because a secret this large could not simply be hidden. It had to be explained away. The Discoverer program was presented to the public and the press as a scientific and engineering venture, a series of experiments in the new business of operating in space, and some of the early flights genuinely carried biological payloads to support that story, including small animals such as mice, meant to test how living things fared in orbit. Reporters wrote about the science. The public followed the launches as part of the young space race. And all the while, the real purpose of the effort, and the real reason the government cared so much about perfecting the delicate art of returning a capsule from orbit, stayed locked away. The real project carried a different name, one kept out of every public word for more than 3 decades. It was called Corona. It was run jointly by the Central Intelligence Agency and the Air Force, and the man the agency placed in charge of driving it into being was a brilliant, relentless economist-turned-intelligence officer named Richard Bissell, the very same man who had already given the country the U-2 spy plane. The concept behind Corona was almost outrageously ambitious for its day. A rocket would carry a satellite up into orbit. Inside that satellite, a specially designed panoramic camera would sweep back and forth, photographing the ground in long, continuous strips as the satellite raced across the Soviet Union at thousands of miles per hour. The exposed film would then be wound into a small re-entry capsule. On command from the ground, that capsule would separate from the satellite, fire a small rocket motor to drop itself out of orbit, plunge back down through the searing heat of atmospheric re-entry behind a protective shield, and finally float down gently under a parachute. Paz, Kamiah. And then, because the precious film could not be trusted to survive an ocean landing and could never be allowed to come down on foreign soil, an aircraft would fly out over the empty Pacific and physically catch the falling capsule in midair, snatching it out of the sky. Every one of those steps had to succeed, in sequence, on the same mission, and not a single one of them had ever been accomplished before by anyone. The reward, if the whole chain could be made to work, was almost beyond price. There was simply no defense against it anywhere in the world. A camera flying through space could not be shot at, could not be intercepted, and could not be warned off through diplomatic protest. The arithmetic of it was as plain as the arithmetic of any arms race. If the machine flew and the film came home, America would finally see everything it had, spent years straining and failing to see. The only real question left was whether the thing would fly at all. For a long and demoralizing stretch, it would not. The failures came one after another, a grinding, humiliating procession of them that stretched across roughly a year and a half. Rockets exploded on the launch pad in clouds of fire. Satellites tumbled into useless wrong orbits and were lost. Capsules fired their small return rockets in the wrong direction entirely and vanished outward into space instead of dropping home. Parachutes tore or failed to open. Recovery aircraft searched the ocean sky and came home with empty hooks. The first 12 Discoverer flights all failed, in one way or another, before anything at all came back successfully. The very first of them was lost soon after it went up. Another was believed to have come down somewhere near the frozen islands north of Norway. Its capsule never recovered, sparking a small secret scramble over where it had landed. One of the most maddening failures of all carried the first genuinely working camera into orbit, and then lost its capsule on the way home when a spin motor tore itself to pieces at exactly the wrong instant. Each failure was picked apart and studied. Each identified flaw was fixed, and each fix seemed only to expose a new and different flaw waiting behind it. The engineers were, in effect, inventing spaceflight and space reconnaissance at the very same time, in full view, under a cover story thin enough that the endless run of failures became a quiet national embarrassment splashed across the newspapers. Out over the Pacific, meanwhile, a special squadron of airmen based in Hawaii was training for a task that had never been performed in the history of flight. The idea of snatching a falling object out of the sky with a trailing hook was not entirely new in principle, but doing it with a capsule dropping from orbit, descending fast under a parachute at sea, hundreds of miles from land, with only a brief window before it hit the water, was something else entirely. The crews practiced by having one aircraft drop a dummy capsule under a parachute, while another aircraft flew in behind and below it, trying to catch the parachute in the trailing loop of hooks and reel the load aboard through the open rear of the plane. It demanded precise flying, perfect timing, and steady nerves, because the aircraft had to fly directly at a falling target and thread it into a loop of line only a little wider than the parachute itself. For month after month, these crews rehearsed a catch that the failing satellites above them never gave them the chance to make. They were the last link in a chain, whose earlier links kept snapping, ready and waiting for a payload that refused to arrive. The strain of so much failure told on everyone involved. A program that spends heavily, launches often, and produces nothing but wreckage, invites hard questions, and this one drew them. There was real discouragement in the ranks and real pressure from above, and more than once the effort might easily have been abandoned as a costly embarrassment. What kept it alive was a stubborn conviction among the men who ran it, Bissell chief among them, that the payoff was worth almost any number of failures, because nothing else in the American arsenal could ever do what this machine promised to do. Every failure was treated not as a reason to quit, but as a lesson to be wrung dry, a flaw to be understood so that the next flight might carry one fewer way to fail. It was slow, expensive, painful faith in a thing that had never once worked, sustained on the belief that it eventually would. Then, at the worst imaginable moment, America lost its other eye as well. On May 1, 1960, a U-2, flown by a pilot named Francis Gary Powers, was crossing deep inside Soviet territory near the industrial city of Sverdlovsk, when a Soviet surface-to-air missile at last managed to bring one of the untouchable planes down out of the sky. Powers survived the destruction of his aircraft, parachuted down into Soviet hands, and was soon paraded before the cameras of the world. Khrushchev sprang the trap with obvious relish. He first announced only that an American plane had been shot down, and then, after American officials had confidently claimed it was merely a stray weather research flight that had wandered off course, he revealed that the pilot was alive and in custody and that the wreckage was plainly a spy plane. It was a public humiliation, and it wrecked an upcoming summit between the powers. More importantly for our story, the overflights of the Soviet Union stopped immediately and completely. They were simply far too dangerous to continue now that the Soviets could reach them. So consider where the United States stood in that summer. The old way of seeing into the Soviet Union had just been shot out of the sky in front of the entire world. The new way of seeing had failed a dozen times in a row and had yet to return a single usable photograph. And the missile gap panic was reaching its absolute peak in the middle of a presidential election year, with candidates warning gravely that the country was falling behind an enemy that nobody, in fact, could actually measure. The nation was blind, frightened, and rapidly running out of options. The political noise around all of this had by then grown deafening, and it fed on the very darkness that made the truth impossible to reach. Newspaper columnists gave the fear its shape and its momentum. One of the most influential, the syndicated writer, Joseph Alsop, laid out the nightmare in hard and specific numbers, leaning on classified projections that had been leaked to him. In a series of columns beginning in the summer of 1958, he warned that the Soviets were racing toward a commanding lead, with the number of their intercontinental missiles climbing into the hundreds within a year or two, and toward 1,000 and beyond soon after. His exact figures shifted from one column to the next, but the thrust of them never did. He presented the coming Soviet advantage not as one possibility among several, but as a looming and near-certain doom. Politicians reached for the same theme. Senator Stuart Symington, a former Air Force secretary, pressed the highest and most alarming estimates hard in the halls of Congress. And a young senator running for president, John Kennedy, made the missile gap one of the central arguments of his campaign. On the floor of the Senate early in 1960, he warned that for the first time since the War of 1812, a foreign enemy stood as a direct and unmistakable threat to the American homeland, to American homes and American families. Later that year, he told a national television audience that the Soviets had made the great breakthrough in space and in missiles, and that they were therefore going to be ahead of the United States in the most decisive weapons of the coming decade. President Eisenhower, who quietly suspected from his U-2 photographs that the whole gap was a phantom, even arranged for Kennedy to be briefed by the military and the intelligence agencies during the campaign. Still, the rhetoric rolled on because the one thing that could end it, hard proof, did not yet exist. Behind the scenes, the intelligence agencies were locked in their own bitter fight over exactly these numbers, and the split fell along predictable lines. Air Force intelligence consistently pushed the highest estimates. It had institutional reasons to do so, since a larger Soviet threat justified a larger American bomber and missile program and a larger Air Force budget, and its senior commanders genuinely argued that the missing Soviet missiles were simply hidden away in the vast regions the U-2 had never managed to photograph. The estimate of 500 Soviet missiles by 1960 had come out of that high-end thinking. The Central Intelligence Agency, weighing the same fragments of evidence, arrived at numbers that were far lower and that kept falling as time went on, dropping toward a projection of only a few dozen by the end of 1960. But even the lower figures still overstated the reality, and none of the competing camps could prove its case, because in the end they were all arguing about territory that no one could actually see. The debate was a shouting match, conducted in the dark, and the loudest and most frightening voices carried a natural advantage, because a terrifying claim that cannot be disproven tends to win. There was, in truth, one group of people in Washington who quietly doubted the whole nightmare, and they had reason to. The U-2 overflights, for all their narrow limits, had already photographed some of the most important ground in the Soviet Union, including the main rocket test site out on the Barren Steppe, the place the West came to know through the nearby rail town and would later call Baikonur. The planes had watched the Soviets test their giant rocket. They had mapped known facilities. And across the flights they had managed to fly, they had simply not found the enormous sprawling missile deployment that the highest estimates demanded must be out there somewhere. The same planes had already helped puncture the earlier bomber scare in exactly the same way, by going and looking and failing to find the vast fleet that fear had promised. President Eisenhower, who saw these photographs and understood what they did and did not show, grew increasingly convinced that the missile gap was a phantom. But he was trapped by his own secret. He could not stand up before the nation and explain that he knew the Soviets had few missiles, because to do so would be to reveal that American aircraft were flying over Soviet territory in violation of every rule of sovereignty, handing Moscow a propaganda weapon and exposing the most valuable intelligence method the country possessed. So, the president who is most sure the panic was hollow was also the president least able to say so out loud. He had the answer and could not use it, and the fear rolled on without him. For the truth to finally break through all of that noise, an unlikely chain of events had to succeed all at once, with almost no room for error. It was the height of the summer of 1960. A presidential campaign was being fought in part over this very question, with one side insisting the Soviets had seized a commanding lead in the weapons that would decide the age. Inside the government, the small number of men who had actually seen the earlier spy plane photographs strongly suspected the gap was a myth. But quiet suspicion was not the same thing as proof, and they could not simply announce what they believed without revealing the secret methods by which they had come to believe it. Only one tool in the world could settle the question once and for all, and that tool was still failing on the launch pad. For it to work, 4 entirely separate things had to go right on a single flight in strict order, with no second chance if any one of them went wrong. The rocket had to reach orbit. The camera had to run and expose its film. The capsule had to survive the fire of re-entry and descend under a good parachute. And then, a man in an airplane had to find a small falling bucket somewhere in the enormous empty sky above the ocean and physically pluck it out of the air. Fail any single step, and the entire mission was worthless, and the darkness would hold a while longer. The whole answer to a national panic now balanced on a sequence of events with essentially no margin for failure at all. The first real sign that it might actually come together arrived on August 10 and 11, 1960. A flight called Discoverer 13 went up, carrying no camera at all. It was a test of the machinery itself, a full rehearsal for the difficult business of the return. This time, at last, everything held together. The capsule dropped cleanly out of orbit, came down over the Pacific, and although the recovery aircraft missed the mid-air catch on this occasion, the Navy was able to pull the floating capsule out of the sea. It was the first man-made object ever brought back from orbit by human beings, a genuine milestone in the history of spaceflight, and the engineers had finally proven that the hardest part of the whole design could actually be done. Fittingly, that first returned capsule carried a small American flag, and it was presented afterward to President Eisenhower himself. The rehearsal had worked. Now it was time for the performance that actually mattered. 8 days later, on August 18, 1960, a rocket rose off the pad, carrying the flight the public knew only as Discoverer 14. This one had the camera aboard. As the satellite swept across the Soviet Union far below, the panoramic lens moved steadily back and forth, and mile after mile of the closed and hidden country rolled beneath it and was captured on the moving film. The test ranges, the airfields, the rail lines, and the industrial sites. And, most importantly of all, the long, empty stretches of ground where the great Soviet missile army was supposed to be standing. The satellite made its passes, wound its exposed film safely into the re-entry capsule, and made ready to send the whole precious cargo home. Core. The following morning, the capsule separated, fired its small rocket, dropped through the atmosphere, and opened its parachute high over the Pacific to the southwest of Hawaii, beginning its slow drift down toward the waiting recovery aircraft. Which brings us back at last to Captain Harold Mitchell, 2 passes down, watching a white parachute descend out of the morning sky with the answer to a nation's deepest fear hanging quietly beneath it. He brought the flying boxcar around for a 3rd time. Behind the aircraft, that long, trailing loop of line, with its dangling steel hooks, streamed through the air. He lined the plane up carefully on the descending parachute, judged the closing distance by eye and by instinct, and flew the trailing gear straight across the path of the falling capsule. This time, the hooks caught. The line snapped taut with a jolt. The capsule was hooked, swinging now behind and below the aircraft, and the crew worked it in through the open tail and reeled it safely aboard. 1 rocket to orbit, 1 camera, 3,000 feet of exposed film, 1 clean catch made on the 3rd pass over open water, hundreds of miles from land. And with that single catch, a curtain that had hidden the interior of the Soviet Union from American eyes for years was finally torn wide open. Every step in that seemingly impossible chain had at last held together on one flight, and the film was already on its way to the small circle of people who knew how to read it. What happened next took place in a photographic interpretation center back in the United States, under the direction of a veteran analyst named Arthur Lundell, who ran the government's photo interpretation effort and who possessed a rare gift for reading, meaning out of grey shapes, on film. When the developed images from Discoverer 14 were laid out for study, his people saw something no American had ever seen before. Long photographic strips ran clear across the Soviet Union and the territory around it, sweeping from north to south, covering an area that utterly dwarfed anything a single spy plane flight had ever brought back. Lundell gathered his staff together to show them the broad swaths of coverage crossing more than a fifth of the target region's entire area in a single mission, and the room reportedly broke into open cheers. The work these interpreters did was a craft all its own, closer to detective work than to simple looking. Bent over light tables with magnifiers and stereo viewers, they teased three-dimensional shape out of flat grey film, measured the length of shadows to work out the height of towers and buildings, compared one pass against another to catch what had changed, and learned to recognize the signature of a launch site, an airfield, or a factory from patterns most eyes would slide right past. A single frame could hold a discovery, and a trained interpreter was the person who could find it. Now, instead of the thin trickle of imagery they had rationed for years, these analysts suddenly had more of the Soviet Union spread before them than they had ever dared hope to see at once. Years later, when the figures were finally made public, they were almost hard to believe. That first successful mission returned photographs covering more than 1,650,000 square miles of Soviet territory. It was more coverage of the Soviet Union from that one flight than every single U-2 mission over that country had produced in all the years before it, added together. The man who had driven the whole program into existence, Richard Bissell, later described the transformation in a single unforgettable phrase. Overnight, he said, they had gone from famine to feast. And then the real search began. Mission after mission followed the first success, and the cameras swept methodically across the vast open spaces where the feared Soviet missile force was supposed to stand ready. The analysts knew precisely what a launch complex for the giant Soviet rocket ought to look like from above. They knew its enormous scale, its distinctive shape, its unmistakable signature stamped on the ground. So they searched for it, region by region, checking off the plausible ground, one photograph at a time. And what they found over and over again was nothing. There was no wall of 500 missiles waiting in the grass. There was no hidden field of 100. There was not even a fraction of that. The unglamorous, patient work of photographing the Soviet Union from orbit and studying every image inch by inch was steadily and decisively proving a negative, and it was very likely the single most important negative of the entire Cold War. The missiles that had frightened a superpower for 3 straight years simply were not there. The shift this produced inside the American government is genuinely difficult to overstate. For years, the entire debate over Soviet strength had been little more than a shouting match between competing guesses, with the highest and most frightening estimates carrying their own dark momentum, precisely because no one on Earth could disprove them. Now, for the first time, the argument could be settled with hard evidence laid out on a light table. America was no longer squinting through a keyhole at a country it could barely make out. It could finally see. The panic had been built entirely on the darkness, and the darkness had now been swept away. But turning that new and hard-won certainty into an official, on-the-record verdict, and then reckoning honestly with everything the years of fear had actually cost, would take a little longer still. And when the full accounting came, it carried an irony sharp enough to sting anyone who had lived through the fear. The reckoning arrived in numbers and in the careful, cautious language of government. In a background briefing given to reporters in February of 1961, the new Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, let it become understood that there were no signs of any Soviet crash program to build these missiles, and that there was, in his words, no missile gap. The remark set off an immediate uproar because it cut directly against the fears that the recent campaign had ridden all the way to the White House, and the administration scrambled awkwardly to blur and soften what he had said. The awkwardness was acute, and it was personal. John Kennedy had ridden the missile gap into the White House, warning voters through the campaign that the country was falling dangerously behind. Now, he had been in office only a matter of weeks, and his own Secretary of Defense was quietly telling reporters that the frightening gap the new president had run on did not, in fact, exist. It was one thing to raise an alarm from the outside as a candidate. It was quite another to walk it back from the inside as the man now responsible for the nation's defense, without appearing to admit that the alarm had been overdrawn all along. The truth, once the cameras had delivered it, did not care about any of that. The numbers were what they were, and the men who now held power had to find a way to live with a reality that flatly contradicted the fears that had helped carry them to it. But the intelligence itself kept pointing steadily in the same direction, no matter how the politics twisted around it. On September 21, 1961, a formal national intelligence estimate stated the matter about as plainly as such documents ever do. Two information, it reported, had forced a sharp downward revision in the estimate of Soviet missile strength. Its conclusion was that the Soviet Union at that time possessed something in the range of 10 to 25 launchers from which missiles could actually be fired at the United States. Standing against that modest number were well over 100 American intercontinental missiles, along with a growing fleet of submarine-launched missiles and the most powerful bomber force in the history of the world. The gap was real after all. It had simply been pointing in the opposite direction the entire time. That is the irony sitting at the very heart of this whole affair. Through every single month of the missile gap panic, the United States had never once actually been behind. Its own first intercontinental missile had reached operational status in the autumn of 1959, and across all the years of fear, America had held a steady and often crushing lead in the very category of weapons it believed with such certainty that it was losing. The nightmare of a defenseless nation staring helplessly up at an overwhelming Soviet missile army had been, from beginning to end, nothing but a shadow cast by a leader's boast and by a nation's inability to see. Khrushchev had bluffed with a weak hand. The darkness had done the rest of the work for him, and one of the most powerful countries that had ever existed had very nearly frightened itself into a frenzy over an enemy force that at its peak could have been counted on the fingers of two hands. When the cameras finally cut through the dark, they did not reveal a hidden Soviet strength that had been lurking there all along. They revealed a hidden Soviet weakness, and alongside it an American strength that had been standing in plain view the whole time, if only anyone had been able to look. Knowing the truth changed how the United States behaved at the sharpest edges of the Cold War, and it did so almost immediately. When a dangerous crisis flared over the divided city of Berlin in the summer and autumn of 1961, American leaders no longer had to guess at the strategic balance behind Soviet threats. They knew, from the cameras, roughly what the other side actually held, and that knowledge stiffened their resolve and steadied their hands. A year later, when Soviet missiles were discovered being installed in Cuba in October of 1962, the same photographic intelligence that had ended the missile gap, read by many of the same interpreters, gave President Kennedy a clear and accurate understanding of the wider balance of forces, even as the world stood closer to nuclear war than it ever had before or has since. Knowing that the Soviet intercontinental force was small did not make that crisis safe, but it meant the American side was reasoning from facts rather than from fear. There was, however, one last twist of irony in it all. Even after the government knew for certain that no missile gap existed, the Kennedy administration went ahead and built a huge new force of American missiles anyway, ordering roughly 1,000 of the compact, solid-fueled weapons that would become the backbone of the arsenal for decades. Part of the reason was prudence. Part of it was politics, the difficulty of standing down from a fear the same men had helped to raise. The panic had been proven false, and the country armed against it all the same. The people who made that revelation possible mostly could not be told about what they had done, and their later lives ran off in very different directions. Richard Bissell, the driven man who had willed both the spy plane and the spy satellite into existence, soon staked his career on another and very different secret operation, the invasion of Cuba at the Bay of Pigs in the spring of 1961. That operation failed catastrophically, and it effectively ended him at the agency he had served so brilliantly. He was eased out of the Central Intelligence Agency within about a year. Yet, even as the failed invasion was ending his career, President Kennedy awarded him the National Security Medal in recognition of the intelligence breakthroughs he had led, and he had briefly helped to stand up the new national office that would go on to run America's fleet of spy satellites before he left government service for good. He died in 1994, with his single greatest triumphs still only half known to the public he had protected. Arthur Lundahl, the master analyst whose interpreters were the first human beings to read the Discoverer film, went on the very next year to lead the interpretation of the photographs that revealed Soviet missiles being installed in Cuba, arguably the most dangerous moment of the entire Cold War. And he served his country's cameras faithfully into the early 1970s. He died in 1992. Captain Harold Mitchell, the pilot who made that catch over the Pacific on the third pass, received the Distinguished Flying Cross for the feat, and his crew received the Air Medal, honors handed out for a mission whose true purpose and true importance they were not permitted to explain to anyone outside the tight circle of the secret. Francis Gary Powers, the U-2 pilot whose loss had marked the low point of American blindness, did not stay in Soviet hands forever. In February of 1962, he was exchanged on a bridge between East and West Berlin for a captured Soviet intelligence officer named Rudolf Abel, walking back to his own side in one of the era's most famous spy trades, though he returned to her homeland, unsure whether to treat him as a victim or a failure. On the far side of the world, the chief designer never lived to be openly known in his own lifetime at all. Sergei Korolev, the hidden genius whose rocket had started this entire panic by lifting Sputnik into the night sky, remained an anonymous state secret right up until the end. He died on an operating table in January of 1966, his body worn down by years that had included brutal imprisonment in the Soviet labor camps during an earlier era of terror. Only in his death notice did the Soviet public at last learn his name and see his face, the hidden architect of the entire space age finally revealed to his own countrymen in his obituary. He had built the most famous rocket on Earth, and almost no one had ever been permitted to know that it was his. And the program itself, the effort that had quietly ended the missile gap, stayed a closely guarded secret for an entire generation after it had done its most important work. The men and women who ran it, who flew its rockets, who caught its capsules, and who read its film carried that silence with them for decades. They had quietly resolved one of the most dangerous misjudgments of the whole nuclear age, a misjudgment that might otherwise have driven the arms race and the politics of the era in far more dangerous directions, and they could not breathe a word about it to their neighbors, their friends, or, in many cases, even their own families. That was the price of the secret. The very truth that had calmed a superpower had to remain hidden away, so that the method behind it could keep on working, flight after flight, for years to come. Only near the very end of the century did the story finally come out into the daylight. On February 22, 1995, President Bill Clinton signed an order formally declassifying the early satellite photographs, and 2 days later, the images were unveiled to the press. Vice President Al Gore had pushed hard for their release, arguing that the vast secret archive of pictures could serve science and the study of a changing planet, from vanishing forests to shifting coastlines. When the numbers were at last made public, the sheer scale of what had been built and operated in secret finally became clear. Across roughly a dozen years of operation, from that first success in 1960 until the program wound down in 1972, the satellites had flown around 145 missions and had brought home more than 800,000 photographic images of a world that had been sealed against outside eyes. The program that ordinary Americans had never once heard of turned out to be one of the most consequential intelligence undertakings their country ever mounted. A machine that had traded fear for knowledge at exactly the moment the country needed it most. Its success also gave birth to something that would outlast it by generations. Out of the effort to build and run America's spy satellites grew a new and deeply secret organization created in 1961 to manage the nation's overhead reconnaissance, an agency so secret that even its name was kept classified for decades, and the government would not officially admit that it existed. The little capsule caught over the Pacific was, in that sense, the seed of a permanent American eye in space, one that never again closed. The techniques pioneered under all that secrecy, the cameras, the film return, the interpretation, matured over the following years into ever sharper and more capable systems, and the constant flow of imagery they produced became one of the quiet foundations of stability between the superpowers. When later arms control agreements were signed, each side could actually verify what the other was doing, in part because the machines first proven over the Pacific in 1960 had made such verification possible. A tool built to answer a single frightening question had become a permanent instrument of statecraft. The problem it had been built to solve, however, never truly went away. It only changed hands, and it grew far more open. In the summer of 2021, independent analysts at more than one research group, working not with secret government satellites but with ordinary commercial imagery that almost anyone could purchase, noticed something remarkable in the deserts of western China. Hundreds of new circular construction sites, laid out in tidy geometric grids, were rising out of the bare ground. They had every appearance of fields of missile silos. One team identified roughly 120 of them at a site in the northwest. Another team soon found a second field, of similar size not far away, and the counts across the new sites ran into the low hundreds. The details remain genuinely debated among experts, and it is worth stating plainly that construction sites and analysts' estimates are not the same thing as confirmed, loaded operational weapons. But the underlying pattern would have been instantly familiar to Arthur Lundell's interpreters, bent over their light tables. Once again, the world was straining to read a rival power's true strength from photographs taken high overhead. And once again, the truly hard part was not the seeing itself, but the judging of what the images actually meant, and the discipline required to separate an adversary's capability from its intentions. The one great difference was this: the eye in the sky, once the jealously guarded secret of two superpowers, now belonged to almost anyone with the will to look. That is the strange and lasting inheritance of the summer of 1960. The missile gap was not closed by building a bigger bomb or a faster rocket or a stronger wall. It was closed by a photograph. A closed and secretive country had gambled everything on remaining invisible, and in the empty space left by everything the United States could not see, a boast had swelled and hardened into a genuine national terror. That terror began to die the very moment the seeing began. And the scene began with a fat, ungainly cargo plane droning over the Pacific, a long loop of line trailing from its oven tail, and a single pilot on his third pass reaching out into empty sky to catch a small falling bucket of film. When Harold Mitchell's hooks finally closed around that capsule on the bright morning of August 19, 1960, the loudest fear of the age quietly began to end, and for a long time afterward, hardly anyone on Earth was permitted to know the reason why.